Welcome to my world history notes, where I read from the book I wrote to teach homeschoolers world history. It's a survey, on the surface. Bible Believer looks at world history. You can find it on lulu.com, amazon.com, or at the Bible Baptist bookstore. It's from the perspective of a Bible believer. So if you're an atheist, Muslim, Hindu, Roman Catholic, many Protestant faiths, Greek Orthodox, you agnostic, you won't agree with my conclusions. That's not the point. The point is that you have a conclusion yourself from your study of world history, and not just reading somebody else's opinion either. So I hope you'll follow along with me, and we're going to discuss medieval Europe today to a certain extent. We have several sessions about this, but I'm going to start my chapter 16 in the book, Darkest Before the Dawn in Europe, the Late Medieval Period. God wills it, quote unquote, was the battle cry of the First Crusade that the Roman Catholic Church sent to assault what is the, quote, Holy Land for three world religions, Palestine, and specifically the area of Jerusalem. A great source of information about the Crusades is Zoe Oldenburg's The Crusades. But before we discuss the Crusades, I want to first explore the minds and the culture of the medieval men and women of Europe. The majority of early medieval Europe was completely rural, with vast areas completely without towns or composed of only villages with a few hundred inhabitants or so. An article by Georges Duby tells us in Social History of Western Civilization, edited by Richard M. Golden. The people in these small villages were completely involved in working fields and farms surrounding them. Even for those in the few larger urban areas, life was dominated by the seasons and by the produce of the ground. They were dependent on it for their wealth and their basic livelihood. The Roman Catholic Church ruled virtually unopposed throughout all of Europe, with the exception of these small pockets of New Testament Christianity that survived amidst persecution and being hunted like wild game. Therefore, the average medieval child was baptized as a baby, having made no profession of faith, nor even knowing what was happening to it, and was immediately subject to the laws of the church. Every child received a, quote, Christian name, usually the name of a bona fide Catholic saint. Saints for the Catholic Church were different than saints in the Bible. In the Old and New Testament, all of God's people are his saints. Oh, fear the Lord, ye his saints, for there is no want in them that fear him. Psalm 34:9. And it came to pass, as Peter had passed throughout all quarters, he came out also to the saints which dwell at Lydda. Acts 9:32. But in the Roman Catholic mythology, any important person in the church or martyr or even a pagan god brought over from the old religions would become, at the order of the Pope and the church hierarchy, a godlike entity that would bestow blessings on those who prayed to him or her from the other side of death. Surnames, added names, were of various origins and usually had to do with kinship, Arthur Johnson, occupation, Thomas Smith, a bodily or character feature, Agnes Redhead, or church oriented, Robert Litany. There was an extremely high infant and childhood mortality rate, so that many more children died early on than survived to adulthood. Families lived close together, and cousins, aunts, uncles, and grandparents were always near to instruct, train, and raise the individual to be useful to their small society. Christian ethics, that is, Catholic ethics, were taught to every child of the church, and it wasn't until the Crusades introduced some of the baser elements of Oriental morality to Europe that some of the more egregious evils of the pagan world, such as pederasty, returned in full force, much like how many new and old habits and morals came home from World Wars I and II, Korea and Vietnam, with returning servicemen that were alien to American tradition and custom. An example would be how the average American woman viewed the use of makeup before and after the experience of World War I. With some men taking holy orders and entering a monastery, a home for monks, and women entering a convent as nuns, called a nunnery in some early literature, sexual custom became even more confused due to the unisex isolation. So much so that in 1177, Henry, abbot, that's the head of a monastery of Clairvaux, wrote of France that, quote, ancient Sodom is springing up from her ashes, as we're told by Durant in Volume 4 of this story of civilization entitled The Age of Faith. Throughout Europe, in spite of the nominal adherence to the church's precepts and with a lack of the, quote, born again experience of the Bible and a daily relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ, promiscuity and sexual immorality were as common then as they are today. There was just no billboards. There were no billboards, radios, television, or movies praising the virtues of sin. Youth was brief and risky, and marriage came early in medieval Europe. A child of 7 could consent to a betrothal, a commitment to marry, and engagements such as this were often made to protect the inheritance of property. One example that Durant gives us is the little girl named Grace de Salaby, who was married to a rich noble at age 4 and who then died. At age 6, she was married to another who also died. And at age 11, she was married to a third. A union could be annulled at any time before the child was old enough to consummate the marriage, which for girls was usually 12 and for boys 14. The consent of the parents was not necessary according to the church. When I use a capital C in my writing, I'm referring to the Roman Catholic Church. If the children were of age of consent, which at times could have been 15 for girls. So that was the consent of the parents were not necessary according to the church if they reached 15, girls did. Marriage was often an economic necessity, a partnership designed to protect money or the rights to land. Not only the engagement, but the wedding itself, the word coming from the Anglo Saxon wedian or promise, also being a pledge, was in many instances a financial relationship. Both state and church acknowledged a consummated union accompanied by a verbal pledge as a marriage, even without a legal or ecclesiastical church ceremony. It wasn't until the Council of Trent in 1563, that great act of counter Reformation against Protestantism and the Anabaptist sext, that a priest was required to be present. Marriage between a Catholic and an unbaptized person was forbidden, although marriages between Christian and Jews were not uncommon. The church permitted separation for adultery or cruelty, and this was called by the Latin divortium. But not until Pope Innocent III refused to grant a divorce to Philip Augustus, the King of France, was the church powerful enough in the realm of marriage to forbid local customs regarding actual divorce and remarriage. This will be an important matter when we get to the era of the Reformation in England. Church beliefs were harsh on women. While many church dictates made her not much more than a possession, other Catholic principles improved her status. To priests and theologians, much like the ancient Greeks, a woman was a quote necessary evil, a type of Eve who was accused of bringing man down, and according to Thomas Aquinas, a famous Catholic theologian, still Satan's preferred method of leading men to hell. Civil law in the medieval period was even harsher than church law for women, although some pagan cultures had given women more of a legal standing than during the age of the church. Women could be beaten by their husbands, often could not give testimony in court, and a person was fined only half of what was expected for a crime against a man if a woman was the victim. Still, the medieval Catholic mind was split on its opinion of women. Men worshipped her as a goddess and that they prayed to Mary, the Catholic incarnation of Ishtar, not the simple but obedient Jewish maiden of the Bible, and yet spoke of the ideal woman as an obedient servant, even while dreaming of her as a goddess. Knights fought over a lady's handkerchief, and poets wrote of woman's virtue, while monks tried to convince themselves of her inferiority. There were, however, many noteworthy women in the medieval period. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Galla Placidia, Theodora, Irene, Anna Comnena, Heloise, etc., were famous in their time and after that. So we're going to talk some more about well, no, I'm going to finish this, this section here. Hang on. Just bear with me. Generally speaking, life in medieval Europe was bleak, without much comfort, and very short. The home was simple, often with few windows, protected by wooden shutters, heated by one or more fireplaces. Drafts came through many cracks in the wall. It was not uncommon to wear warm hats and fur indoors in the winter. Furniture, although often well made, was also rare in the home. Chairs were few and low backed, and carpets were unusual before the 13th century. Usually a floor was strewn with rushes or straw, and the common house would have smelled very bad by our standards today. Thick tapestries might be hung from a wall to cover a draft if people were not among the most poor. Cleanliness was not considered important, and the early Roman Catholic disdain for the pagan baths of ancient Rome discounted their use or the care of the body at all as being carnal and worldly. Modern handkerchiefs were unknown as sleeves were used. The common person rarely, if ever, submerged him or herself in a bath. However, the people of the cities began to see public baths in the 12th century, and it is said that Parisians of that century bathed more frequently than they did in the 20th. Another result of the Crusades was the public steam bath being introduced into Europe from the Middle East. Monasteries, feudal castles, and the homes of the wealthy had latrines that emptied into cesspools, but the common man used an outhouse, many of which served more than one family. Chamber pots were unceremoniously dumped into streets, sometimes from upstairs windows, and often with unpleasant effects on pedestrians walking below. The poor slept on beds of straw, and all the sexes shared the same room, and parents and children as well. When you sat down to eat, you might have a knife, there was no fork. A spoon and a bowl of soup was shared. The soup went around, maybe one cup at a table, the cup went around. It was not anything like there were books of etiquette about not sneezing on the tablecloth or things like that. I mean, our ancestors' politeness was lacking. Okay, the courtesy, things like that, comes from the idea of the upper class courtesy. Uh, so it was pretty crude compared to pretty. I don't know, we might say rednecky. So, as for entertainment, the rich might have jugglers, clowns, or musicians at a party. Playing cards were still unknown. Gambling was sometimes forbidden by law and sometimes not. Chess was even forbidden in France by Louis the 19th, Louis the Ninth in 1254. Um, Dancing, while being condemned by the clergy, was practiced by all classes. Sports revolved sports revolved around practicing martial arts or hunting for the most part. Tournaments of knightly martial sports such as jousting and swordplay developed throughout the medieval period. One of the most interesting books on that specific subject is called Tournaments by Richard Barber and Juliet Barker. So this is a small bit of what life was like for the average person in medieval Europe, and it was only a little bit better for the wealthier. The church dominated the thought life of medieval persons, and plain survival from day to day occupied their actions. Comfort and personal hygiene were very rare commodities and not much regarded as important. So I hope that you get something out of this, and even if you disagree with me, that's fine, that you study and come to your own conclusions. I look forward to talking to you again.